Good evening. My name is Dr. Chloe Latham Sikes. I am the Deputy Director of Policy at
You can move that closer to you.
Oh, okay. Deputy Director of Policy at IDRA. And we are also opposed against SB 8, as well as SB 176, 2354, 2483, and Senate Joint Resolution 29, as well as really any other proposals that would take public school funds and divert them to a private setting without any type of public transparency or accountability over those dollars. There was a lot of talk earlier about SB 8's particular $8,000 amount, along with the $10,000 2 years, so $20,000 hold harmless provision, really. This amounts to about $36,000 in those first 2 years of a student's in a program, which is 4 times the amount of the average per pupil state and local funding in Texas, 4 times over from our public schools. There was also a lot of conversation about Florida's program, and in the first decade of Florida's program, it now consumes about 10% of the state education budget. So we did an analysis and sent it to each of your offices of what 10% of the public school money in each of your districts would be. And out of this committee alone, 10% total would be $3.12 billion. That was a 10-year study, but just to get a sense of what that cumulative impact could be, there's a massive financial impact out of our public schools for any of these proposals. My second point, aside from the financial, is again that parent transparency and accountability. We have a financial and an academic accountability system in our public schools, and they are accountable for reporting students' progress in reading and math, accelerated learning outcomes, graduation rates, post-secondary outcomes, all things and other legislation that come before this committee. But we would not have any of that information under any of these proposals. There are some random audits, but no academic accountability about students' outcomes, their performance, and how they do later in life. And relatedly with accountability, the concern around special education protections, bilingual education protections, much of that is waived under these programs. And we're incredibly concerned about what that could mean for students' equal access to free public schools. So with that, we are a resource for any of your offices, and respectfully do oppose this legislation.
Thank you, Dr. Sikes. Thank you very much. Members, any questions? Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A question for Dr. Latham Sikes. Doctor, you have in your letter that you provide us written testimony, I think it's, let's see here, the 5th paragraph. You state that in Florida, similar private school vouchers programs, let's call them ESAs, whatever, that's all the same thing, now consume 10% of the state's public education funding. Now, those were started, if I heard the gentleman from Florida correctly, he said 99, then 01. And so they've been going on for 20 plus years. And now they consume 10% of the state's budget. So my question to you is, you say here that if we assume the same financial impact to all the school districts that we represent, the cost would be over $3.1 billion. Is this a new additional cost to what we have today?
This would be what that amount of money would be coming from your districts. So if that was the, we were using this 10% from a study conducted on the last decade.
Coming out of our current public schools?
Correct. Out of the current, and the ISDs in each of your senatorial districts.
Wow.
If you take 10% of the public education funding from your all the ISDs.
Just this committee?
Just this committee. Yes, sir.
So what would be the total coming out of all 31, or all of the districts?
Much more.
If you could get us that information, I mean, we need to be making, so what you're saying is we could be possibly creating a structural financial hole.
Exactly. I mean, especially with money leaving the system, not only for the payment of an ESA or the reimbursement programs or tax credit scholarships. You're correct. We do consider all of them to be a voucher program because it's public funding that's going into a private use setting. So any number of those would be just calculated across, where you're not only funding that, but you're also losing funding from those school districts for attendance funding. And in addition, in that particular study, calculating that financial impact, they also did find, the Education Law Center did find that in any of the programs across the country that had, sustained voucher style programs, in longitudinal studies looking back at them, those the states also had a decreasing proportion, a decreasing amount of per pupil funding in the public schools. So as the cost of the private school voucher programs rose, and it did, and now that we have the fiscal notes for each of these pieces of legislation, we do see those costs expected to increase. The per pupil spending was going down at the same time for our public schools in each of those districts.
Currently, we rank where in the state in per pupil funding?
40th.
40th currently.
For public, currently Texas is 40th in public school per pupil funding in the country.
In states where these things have passed, that amount of money has gone down.
Correct.
So we'd be going down from 40th.
I would expect so. Yeah, it depends, if that's a comparison with the other states, but that includes Indiana, Utah, Arizona, Ohio. So some states that do generally appear at the bottom of the list. Utah, I think, appears at the very bottom of that list, 50th. But we are currently 40th as it stands now for per pupil funding in our public schools.
Dr. IDRA, its origin is in equity funding in Edgewood versus Rodriguez. Today is the 50th anniversary. Today marks that day.
Yes, sir.
What would this do to equity in terms of school districts? How would this impact equity?
We've actually seen that play out in Edgewood ISD. In the 90s, there was a small kind of private opportunity scholarship, as it was called, voucher program, and it was targeted toward very low-income families. And what we saw was there were not academic gains, and that the money, leaves the district. They were kind of baited to leave the district and attend private schools that did not offer the services and the protected services that we've talked about in bilingual and special education, and also did not provide the academic achievement, academic interventions that we've seen. So, there's that financial piece, and there's also a really unfortunate academic piece of we don't see this as a quality academic intervention either. So in terms of the financial equity, we would see money leaving the system, which constitutionally is supposed to be an efficient public school system that serves all students.
Thank you for your testimony. Thank you, Madam
Thank
Chair.
you, members. Any other?
Madam
Yes,
Chair.
Senator West.
Dr. Sikes, let's stay with Sikes, correct?
Yes, sir.
You talked about longitudinal studies. Have you had an opportunity to compare all of the voucher programs in the country or a representative sample?
I have not personally. We have looked at studies that do a lot of those cross comparisons that have looked at various programs either in their first few years of operation and then also longitudinally, because some have been in existence for decades.
You've been here all day, I guess.
Yes, sir.
You've heard the testimony about the 17 schools, private schools that have been compared, and 14 of them you've seen achievement, 2 of them no achievement, and maybe a smattering of others. What has been your analysis of these schools and their impact?
Yeah, so it depends. Thank you for that question. It depends on how those studies have been bounded, and they can really vary a lot. So some might be looking at a program in its first year or 2 of operation. Typically, what we see is the longer amount of time a private voucher program has been in operation, the lower academic outcomes, and the higher the cost. These are the trends that are across studies, because each of these states do have different programs, different amounts of programs that serve students in different capacities. But those are the trends pretty much across the board. So depending on the studies that were being referenced, it might depend how long they were looking at that program's operation, if there were multiple programs in operation at that state, what type of variables they were looking at, and what data was available to even assess those outcomes. Because as we see in the proposals today and also in existing programs in other states, the data can then become very scarce. We don't necessarily have the student academic outcomes, disciplinary data. There's some provisions here for some admission and enrollment data, but that doesn't necessarily mean we have an idea of the churn of students who enter those programs and then go back into the public system. So to say that there are just some studies showing certain outcomes is difficult, because we don't necessarily have all the data from even how these programs have operated and the students that have been in them.